Good morning. I'm Carol Costello. Thank you so much for joining me. At any moment now, we're expecting President Obama to hold a news conference in Greece, the first stop of his final trip abroad as leader of the free world. Ironically, much of President Obama's mission is to serve as a liaison for his successor. Mr. Obama will likely address allies. That President Trup will also honor the U.S. commitment to NATO and its long-standing loyalties in Europe and Asia. We begin this hour in Athens, then, where CNN's Michelle Kosinski is traveling with the president. Good morning, Michelle.
Hi, Carol. Yeah, just think over this past year, as the president's been on all of these foreign trips, one after the other, meeting with key allies, one thing he's been doing is reassuring them that he didn't think there was going to be a Trump presidency. He described other leaders as rattled at that prospect. Well, that's not how things turned out. And so now his goal is to reassure them, but in much different ways. And one of those aspects that they've been worried about is, of course, NATO. I mean, you could say, given Russia's activities and other things going on, touching on Europe, there's never been a more important time for NATO since World War II. And some of the things that were said on the trail, for example, Donald Trump casting doubt on whether the U.S. would continue to defend its allies. Well, now the president says that when he sat down with Donald Trump last week, Trump did express a commitment to NATO. So that's one of the things President Obama will use as he's speaking to these world leaders throughout his trip. Here's part of what he said earlier today. Listen.
I want to reaffirm not only our appreciation for the great people in that alliance, but underscore how important we consider the transatlantic alliance. It continues to be a cornerstone of our security that is unwavering, and it is something that provides significant continuity, even as we see a transition of governments in the United States. Across Democratic and Republican administrations, there's a recognition that the NATO alliance is absolutely vital.
So at a press conference yesterday, before he left on this trip, the president said a lot post-election. It's really the first time we've heard him speak extensively. And he said things like, it's important to let Donald Trump make his decisions. And then America will eventually decide whether that leads to progress or not. That Donald Trump has exhibited a willingness to think about other things like allowing parts of Obamacare to remain. And that's a source of optimism for President Obama. So he's walking this line. He's wanting to convey some optimism and some reassurance. But of course, he can't really ignore the things that he himself said on the trail about Donald Trump, namely that he is unfit to serve as president. And of course, the press isn't going to let him forget those things. So he was asked directly about some of those statements. And President Obama conceded that, sure, he has concerns that sound bites are not policies, that there are parts of Donald Trump's temperament that might not serve him well, but he needs to recognize and correct those. But what he wants to convey on this trip is U.S. policies will continue. The U.S. relationships with these other countries will remain strong, Carol.
All right, Michelle Kosinski reporting live from Greece. And, of course, when the president pops out of that mansion along with the Greek president, we'll take you right back to Greece. President-elect Trump has talked to world leaders himself. Vladimir Putin called Trump to offer his congratulations. The two men pledged to improve relations between the U.S. and Russia. Salma Serfati has more on Trump's outreach and his possible pick for Secretary of State. Good morning.
Good morning to you, Carol. Yeah, no Secretary of State pick yet, but we do know, according to sources, that one of the top names that keeps coming up when we look at this short list here of potential contenders for Secretary of State is Rudy Giuliani. He, of course, has been a fierce advocate of Donald Trump, a loyal aide by his side for many months throughout this campaign, but he, of course, has no specific foreign policy experience. That said, it is almost like he is campaigning for this job, certainly pushing for it. He appeared at a Wall Street Journal forum last night where he talked several points during his speech that he would be interested in this job. He talked about how his foreign policy vision aligns with Donald Trump's, but it was really this moment that really stood out to us when he also was talking about John Bolton, former UN ambassador under the George W. Bush administration, how he is also in the running. Here's Rudy Giuliani.
John would be a very good choice.
Is there anybody better?
Maybe me, I don't know.
So if anyone went there, Rudy Giuliani clearly very interested in this job. Also, when you're looking at another top post to be filled, Secretary of Defense, a lot of buzz right now about Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions, who too has been a real Trump loyalist from the start, one of his biggest aides who has advised him throughout his campaign. Although sources also telling my colleague Dana Bash and Sarah Murray that he is also being considered in a top way for a potentially attorney general. So a lot of movement, a lot of names. Carol, we do know that Trump and Mike Pence are meeting later this morning to go over some of these top last names.
All right, Salman Sarfati, thanks so much. So President Obama facing world leaders as anxiety over a Trump presidency grows. Does that make what he says a little later this morning all the more important? With me now to talk about that and more is Nancy Soderberg, former Deputy National Security Advisor at the White House and former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. Errol Lewis is CNN political commentator and political anchor for New York One. And Dana Bash is our CNN chief political correspondent. Welcome to all of you. All right, so Dana, before we delve in to what President Obama might say about Mr. Trump in Greece, Donald Trump's tweeting this morning.
I saw.
You saw? Okay. And he's talking about the Electoral College. So just about a half hour ago, Donald Trump tweeted this, quote, "The Electoral College is actually genius and that it brings all states, including the smaller ones, into play. Campaigning is much different." And then here's another one from a little bit longer ago, 2 minutes before that one, as a matter of fact. Quote, "If the election were based on total popular vote, I would have campaigned in New York, Florida, and California and won even bigger and more easily." So he's tweeting this as these protests continue across the country.
Well, that, but also he's tweeting this as the day after or a few days after Mitt Romney lost in 2012, he reamed the Electoral College as, you know, this horrible institution, which he actually stood by in an interview that he did that aired just this past weekend after he won, saying, "No, I'm not going to change my opinion about the Electoral College just because I won." It seems to me, I don't think I'm going on a very far limb here, that our president-elect is probably watching news, reading, and seeing that the protests are going on, and more importantly, that the Democrats are saying what he had said about the Electoral College when the shoe was on the other foot. Having said that, look, the Electoral College is something that is going to be very, very difficult to change, and the Democrats who are saying that they want to change it probably should remember that they had a huge Electoral College advantage going into Tuesday night, and they blew it. They blew it. I mean, they blew it. They lost the blue states of Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, states that had been blue since the 80s, because they lost their core voters to Donald Trump.
I mean, you can't argue that. That's absolutely true. But still, Errol, there's all of these protests going on across the country. They don't seem to be stopping. There's another big one planned in New York City today. Also, there's a Change.org petition going around with 4 million signatures from people who want to change the Electoral College system to the popular vote system. So in light of all of that going on, right, it's time to unite the country. Do these tweets help?
Well, of course not. And Donald Trump, and we should all start getting used to this. I mean, I think we all saw it quite a bit during the campaign season. Maybe the public hasn't really sort of figured this out yet, but Donald Trump's opinion about a lot of things depends on whether or not it's good for Donald Trump, right? So the Electoral College is an abomination in 2012 because that suited his interest then. The Electoral College is just fine now because he won and it suits his interest now. That's what his talk about a rigged system when he was behind in the polls was all about. Now the system unrigged itself after he has won. So for the demonstrators, though, I think they have to maybe not go down that same path and do take the other side of that, but think more seriously about, you know, what they really want and what they really want to do. I mean, there's a lot of stuff being shouted out there on those protest lines, and a lot of it has to do with his past statements. A lot of it has to do with some of the advisors that he's got around it. A lot of it has to do with the policies that he has proposed, especially things like the immigration removal policy. So, you know, folks are going to have to try and figure out, you know, I mean, they can shout it on the streets every day from now until the end of his first term, but you're going to have to, at some point, figure out which policies are most important, prioritize those, and then figure out an angle of attack.
What exactly you want. So Nancy, do you envision Trump's foreign policy being partly worked out via tweet?
Absolutely. I think Donald Trump is who he is. We're going to see lots of tweets, and diplomats all around the world are going to learn how to use it. But the simple truth is we have no idea what his policies are going to be because he doesn't know yet. And I think the appointments that he picks around him, whether it's ideologues like a John Bolton or professionals like a Steve Hadley or Richard Haas, will prove where his instincts are. And it's pretty clear there's an argument going on in the transition team right now, but these picks will be absolutely critical. If you look at George Bush's first 9 months pre-9/11, and he really hadn't thought about these issues either. He surrounded himself with ideologues who tried to push a very anti-UN, anti-the world, kind of isolationist or bully, we're the lone superpower, therefore we can rule the world, frankly blew up in his face. And he shifted, of course, much more dramatically after 9/11 and worked with the world. And I think Donald Trump will likely go through the education of Donald Trump. Traveled around the world. I do think he's on the short list, but I would caution UNCR be able to do it either when he figures out him to stop talking about human rights and democracy, ignore the fact that he's invaded 2 countries next to him, Crimea and Georgia, that he's exploring the Arctic much faster than we are, and he right now thinks Trump's not going to say anything about all that. My guess is Trump very quickly will begin to stand up to Putin, and that relationship will be very difficult within the first year.
Okay, so in just about, a minute and a half, I think, President Obama will talk about democracy while he's in Greece, and then he and the Greek president will open it up to questions, and reporters will probably toss some questions about Donald Trump into the mix. And what do you think the president will say?
Well, considering how restrained he was on domestic soil yesterday in the briefing room, I can't imagine he's going to be much different on foreign soil, particularly since the way that he left for this trip to Greece, it's almost as if he's in this weird position of being Donald Trump's ambassador to the world to tell the world it's going to be okay. Democracy is still.
Is that
yes.
so weird?
I would be shocked. I will faint here at the table if he doesn't say the words shared interest theories about this idea that the next president will have to sort of chart his own course and that he's not going to interfere.
But here's the thing, Nancy. The world has been riveted to this presidential election in the United States, and they know how nasty it's been, and they know exactly what President Obama has said about Donald Trump and vice versa. So whatever Mr. Obama says, will people overseas believe him?
They will pray that he's right, that we will have a smooth transition, but they're worried. We all travel around the world and talk to people, and before the election were begging us that this wouldn't come true. Now that it has come true, they're holding their breath. A week or so, the Trump people have reached out and said, don't do anything big and bold. I mean, Obama had a fairly aggressive agenda for his last 3 months in office. He can't really do much anymore because the Trump people could undo it right away, and he wants to have a smooth transition. So the world's on edge about Donald Trump, no question. They read the tweets, they've watched what he says, they're nervous about it, particularly Mexico, our trading partners. Europe is always afraid that the U.S. is going to withdraw, our NATO partners. But reality has a healthy way of bringing any of those rhetorics down to earth, rhetorical comments down to earth, and I think they'll be reassured by Obama, but frankly, they're going to wait and see what Donald Trump does during the transition. So far, he's been sending reassuring signals that he's thinking about things, but this is a president who is fundamentally unprepared to take on these issues, and he's got a lot of homework over the transition. The people he puts in place are going to send very important signals. So those of us who care about the foreign policy relationships hope it could go the other way. We just don't know, and it's going to be a riveting transition for the next couple of months.
I'm going to take a quick break. Hopefully when I come back, the president and the Greek president will be out there speaking. I'll be right back.